Excellent.
Good luck.
All right. So, what is telecare or technology-enabled care? It's a system that was basically invented to basically a system that was developed to help things like care homes and residential homes increase response time for emergencies. It was designed in 1957. The original system was Wix, invented by Tunstall Byers, a little company in Yorkshire. It's basically the pull cords you see in residential homes, care homes, that like the red strings you see that get pulled. They raise an emergency response. So as they went through from Wix, which took up a whole wall in an office, they eventually came through with Piper Group or Piper Solo, which was the first in the communicable series. It was still very basic, but it brought down all of the equipment, all of the control equipment into like a 1.5 foot square box with some peripherals, but it meant that there was a lot of space saved with it, and it managed to integrate a lot more equipment. Come 2006, there'd been a lot of iterations in the communicable series between now and, or then and 2006, but in 2006 the communicable Connect was released. It was the first of the computerized versions, which it ran on Windows CE 5. They upgraded this to what they call Connect 6 or Connect VI in 2013. That runs on CE 6, and it's still running on CE 6 to this day. The older version, the 2006 version, was programmed through Java applets over a web interface. The newer version moved all that across to a JavaScript client-side thing, which meant that service engineers found it easier because there was a lot of problems with the laptops. Basically, none of the laptops were working with the Java applets, so they moved it across to JavaScript, which had its own set of horrific faults. So a day in the life of one of the residents of one of these sites would be, like say we've got Fred. So he feels a little off one day, but he'll go out for his morning stroll to get his paper like he does every day. And then he'll come back, and there's usually on these sort of sites, there's something like a coffee morning where they can go and they can sit and have tea and coffee, biscuits and things like that, have a bit of a sense of community. Then, you know, he'll go back up to his apartment, and he'll sit and have you know, his family will come over. They'll sit there having a catch up, and then eventually at the end of the day, when everyone's gone and he's on his own, say he wants to have a shower before bed, slips as he's getting out, there's going to be a red string, or if he's had the sense to keep his pendant with him, which is a radio device, basically like a radio pull cord. If he's had the sense to keep that with him, he can press or pull the pull cord and raise a response from, if someone's on duty at the time, it will be on-site staff. If someone's not on site, it will go through to an alarm receiving center or an ARC, and they can then decide whether they're going to bring in emergency services. So a development manager, which is more like a residential home rather than a care home, but you get development managers, and their job is their job description is to look after the building, but they do some level of looking after the residents as well. So say Christina arrives at work, she'll perform, the first thing she does is perform welfare calls for all of the residents, and they will basically, she checks that they're all okay and there's no issues with them. If there is issues, she can action those issues. Anyone that's vulnerable or doesn't answer, she'll go and knock on their apartment, give them a face-to-face just to check they're okay. Once a week, they're required to action a fire alarm test for the communal fire alarm system. When they do that, they will test a point around the building. That will then go through and use the telecare enabled care system to then raise a call through to the care line or the ARC, which as long as they know it's a test, they won't action it. If they don't know it's a test, it will go straight through to the fire brigade and you'll get a response. It can also be used as a concierge system. So if like you'll get a lot of pharmacies and carers, things like that, trying to gain access. If they can't reach their resident that they need to speak to, they can use the concierge part of this system to speak to either the development managers or the care team, who can then grant them access. If it's out of hours and there's no staff on site, they can obviously speak to the alarm receiving center and be granted access that way. So a typical system, this is the typical thing you'd see on a site. In the middle, you've got the what we call the control unit or sim board. That most of that stuff you wouldn't have to worry about in this situation. But the main things to take away from it are L1 on the left hand side. You've got connected to a telephone line. That's a basic BT telephone line. Nothing special about it. No red care, no nothing. That is their sole connectivity to the alarm receiving center. The other bits are, it's just fancy stuff to add to the system. The speech modules are obviously the bits that are going into the apartments. The 869 receivers are, well, telecare overlay is what is receiving the calls or the signals from anything like a radio device, like a pendant or radio pull cords, smoke detectors. The HSP is it's basically what we call a Tunstall tablet, which is a little device that is sometimes given to managers or care staff so that they can program some things without being like at the control unit. Sometimes they are connected to the internet, which is where most of our risk comes from. But yeah, that's essentially what the typical analog system would look like. For this is the newer versions of Connect or Connect 6, Connect VI, however they want to say it. The newer versions they brought out had or what they called VIP, which wasn't really IP. It was kind of as you can see from the right hand side of this, it's the analog cable going into what they called an SCI, which was designed to look remarkably like a 19-inch router or switch. That then interfaced to Cat6 cabling into each flat, so as a star-wired system, but it wasn't IP. It's none of it is IP other than the IP PBX on the bottom left, which is what you would say is one of the big problems with this type of system. Is if they go down this route of putting it in this way, everything is internet facing. Like there's no way around it. On the analog systems, some are internet facing, some aren't. There's enough on there to be a risk. Each one of these would be internet facing. So in a typical apartment, you'd have, for an analog system, you'd have a 10-core cable which goes through, is daisy chained in and out of flats, and that would be going into this PCB, which would be connected to the speech unit. On the right hand side, you'd have pull cords, which are normally closed, just what we call a closed loop, which is for monitoring. So if you have cabling issues, it would go into it would just constantly call, and you would know that there's an issue with that, and that could be seen to. If it was a normally open circuit, you would have issues in that you wouldn't know that they're failing until you were trying to use them and they failed, which is obviously not really what you want. The detectors on the left hand side, that would be things like a smoke detector, carbon monoxide detector, and they would just trigger their input that they're set up for, and that would then tell whoever's on the receiving end of the alarm calls that is, it's come from a smoke detector input from Fred's flat or carbon monoxide detector, so they could respond accordingly. So why is patching these systems hard? The big thing is, with the way these sites are run, in my experience, they're just going to be hard to patch because of the way they're funded. No costs are incurred by the landlord. It's all passed down to the residents, and none of them want to pay for people like, you know, an engineer like me to go to site to upgrade software when they think there's no reason to. It's not going to gain them anything, so they're not going to want to do it. Not all sites are internet facing, so it's not going to matter for all of them, but there are enough that it's an issue for quite a few sites. Systems can fall over mid-upgrade. If you're upgrading it over the internet, these systems do have a tendency every now and again to just fall flat on their face mid-upgrade, and then you'll have to send an engineer anyway. So it's a lot easier just to have someone on site doing the upgrade and just make it easier. Some field engineers are completely scared of doing the upgrades because there are issues with it, and they can be, if you don't have experience in it, they can be a horror show. There's database compatibility issues between the 2006 Connect and the 2013 Connect. The boards are different, but they are compatible. You can run either on either side, but you will have to rebuild the databases if you're switching from a 2006 to a 2008, and that is usually done by hand because it's just a nightmare. And the legacy systems, which is what the analog type are, they're not supported anymore anyway. I've submitted some bugs to not Tunstall, but another vendor, and those the words given to me were they're not all that worried about them because they're legacy systems, and they're not going to worry about them because they're more focused on their IP equipment, which is, to paraphrase exactly what was said to me, which is worrying. So examples of exploitation for these systems: if you've got a script kiddie, one of the simple things is it's only a Windows CE backend. It falls over its own feet. Sometimes they're horrific. It's pretty easy to DDoS these. I mean, you haven't got to do much to them to get them to fall over. If there's any firewall misconfigurations that leave other ports open on these, that is a huge risk, because one of the biggest risks is they leave Telnet open with no authentication whatsoever, and it just dumps you straight into a command prompt, and you could just deltree the lot of it and just kill the system, and then it's not getting fixed until a board's coming out with an engineer to replace the thing. The inside threats would be someone like me. If I was going to a site and I was, I wanted to cause some damage, there's plenty of things I could do. I have access to the service level settings and things like that. Disconnecting phone lines is another easy one. Switching off the controller is an easy one. The only issues with those are, if you were doing those, they would be caught, because the alarm receiving center will repeatedly throughout the day test the systems to make sure they're responding to calls. If you've got it disconnected in any way, that will be raised as a fault, and an engineer would be sent out to rectify. Hopefully it's not the same engineer. Killware is the kind of the new buzzword from what I've been seeing. If you wanted to find these, Showdown will give you enough of them, but if you don't have access to Showdown, Google Dorking and some brain cells, if you know subnet, and then you can run a Nmap scan, you can find quite a lot of them. That's how I sort of came up with some numbers for research. Denying service to the controller is a huge risk for life. If there's plenty of ways to deny the service of it, and obviously you've got on quite a lot of these sites upwards of 40 apartments, up to, I've seen some that are in the sort of mid hundreds, and if you're denying access to that, you could be, if you did access denial on a Friday evening, left it off all weekend, you could potentially kill quite a lot of residents, I'd say. Obviously, the other way of doing it is if you don't want to completely DDoS it or anything like that. If you were looking to attack these, one of the simplest things would be if you could get into the settings and disable devices through the database. that's a lot quieter, and it's going to take an engineer a lot longer to discover that and start rectifying it. Which brings us to 0 days. Are there any 0 days? Yeah, there's quite a few, to be honest. There's obviously I'm not going to go into great detail, but to sign into these things, it's a lot like I always think of it like a poor man's secure RSA. When you used to get the card with the numbers that would come up and regenerate every now and again, or now like authenticator apps. You have a daily code when you try logging in, if you're trying to log in as a service user. That can be, you are supposed to take that code, send it off to Tunstall, the vendor, and they will send you back a working password. That same hashing algorithm has been used since 2006, and it's piss weak, to be honest. I cracked it originally through reverse engineering the old Java applet. Obviously, at that point, you needed file system access. Luckily, on the new 2013 edition of Connect, they leaked it in the JavaScript files, as you can see from the screenshot, which was really nice that they released the key for it, and you can see everything that you need to, really. The other, or one of the other big risks that is with this is the final functional testing facility that they've given for the quality assurance testers. It's supposed to be used in factory, but it can be reached without authentication, without issues. You can perform system resets. You can actuate the onboard relays on the control board, which are typically connected to things like fire systems or smoke vent systems. Typically anything that's going to evacuate a building is connected to those. So if you were actuating those from across the internet, you are raising a response from a fire brigade, most likely, and evacuating a building, or possibly if they've got a stay put policy, then it might not be as bad, but it's still going to be putting everyone into panic. And you can switch the main phone line that goes off to the telephone network, has a GSM modem backup facility. Typically, they're not connected. There's no GSM modems unless they're a real special case. But if you flip the relay for it, you can switch it to GSM. It won't register that it's not got a phone line, and it won't switch back to the PSTN. So you've effectively disconnected the outgoing line, and to my knowledge, it doesn't report that in any way, shape, or form. So the SQL 3 backend is accessible through SQL Injection, a weird SQL injection that they've developed. Again, like the final functional testing, they've got this facility where you can run it, and they give it all away in the JavaScript. And luckily, as you can see on the right, the only sanitization is done client side. So as soon as you script this out yourself, you bypassed all of that, and it's a cakewalk. From there, you can disable apartments, so you can completely disable the calling from them. You can remove any of their pendants or radio smoke detectors. You can change the alarm center dialing numbers so that it can't dial through to the right centers. I mean, you could set that to whatever phone number you'd want. And you can even revert the board to factory settings. Is something I recently discovered through a certain request, which is that just completely wipes out the system. It can't dial anything. It won't even know where it is. Basically, it has no recollection of any of its settings. And the Tunstall tablet software, HSP, that I mentioned in the diagram of like what the normal systems look like, they have hard-coded plain text credentials just sitting in the .NET software, which, as you can see, the passwords aren't that creative. And if you had a permutation engine that you'd run them through, you'd find your way onto the Wi-Fi systems as well, to be honest. And the good thing is, the Wi-Fi systems, they're all the same on every site. So once you've cracked one, you've cracked them all. So the poor practices of all these manufacturers have done some poor practices. Every vendor that I know has the same credentials on every site. The idea is to make it easier for engineers like me that are attending sites, so that you can just save it once and then your laptop will work on any site. That is not a great way of doing things, in my opinion. It would be easier to have like a centralized database that you could all log into to get this stuff from. The credentials for another vendor, TimeTech, they publish the credentials in their public manuals for a lot of this stuff. Granted, TimeTech, because of the way the system's built, it's not as susceptible to a lot of this stuff, but it's still not great to be publishing all your passwords and your service level passwords for everyone to see. Obviously, Tunstall is still using Telnet and FTP with anonymous logins in 2021, which is not great. The control software like the HSP, I mean, leaving plain text credentials is it's a pretty basic thing I would have said not to do. The testing suite, the final functional testing suite, is just, you can get there from anywhere. It's as soon as you found one of these systems, you can get straight into that and start playing, which is not a great way to be, I don't think. The SQL injection obviously is another big worry. You're putting a lot of stuff at risk, I'd say, by leaving the SQL injection just open to anyone that has found that flaw and can do what they need to do. They can pretty much do anything at that point. The next generation of systems, when we're talking about next gen systems in Wall and Call, it's like full IP systems. Like Apello is the big one at the moment that is bringing out. Theirs is full IP. Tunstall's full IP systems, to my knowledge, are still a kind of a bastardization of a standard system mixed in with IP, and it's like everything Tunstall do gets into being a bit of a mess, to be honest. Apello, like I said, is full IP. Everything in the flats, it's all like networked. It's all tablets and things like that, and it's connected to an IP-enabled alarm center over a VPN. Obviously, the Android tablets that go into the apartments, they all have cameras attached. So, in my opinion, having that and everything else, and knowing the security that is put in place and built into some of these systems, is kind of a risk, especially when you consider that any device on these systems is a network port. So if you've got a door panel, I can take that door panel off, and I've got, if I had a network tap, I could install that straight onto the back of it, and I've got network access. It is as easy as that. Any device on that system, anything that is installed, goes onto the network and is quite easily accessible just by taking something off the wall. You've got network connectivity there. The Wi-Fi passwords, like I say, every vendor that I know uses the same passwords on every site because it's easier for service engineers. And the problem is that also makes it easier for everyone else. As soon as you've got a password, you can get into any of them, and do whatever you want to on those systems. And obviously, one of the big things with the newer systems, you've got Android malware becoming more Android malware is getting everywhere now, and if you've got Android tablets in every single apartment of these buildings, it's it doesn't take a genius to start working out what can happen there. But yeah, that is the end.
Brilliant, Dorian. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. I think you went in a totally different direction from what I was thinking.
Absolutely. and also an extremely important reminder that the things in the Internet of Things can be absolutely anything, and often things people don't even think about.
Yeah.
So I think that was absolutely amazing.
And it's really interesting because, like you said, the elderly cybersecurity awareness is just probably not very high at all, and it's almost a disservice, really, that companies are putting in these incredibly vulnerable devices. Like, I'm a big fan of like not allowing FTP, not allowing Telnet, and over using SSH instead. But like you said, if everything is default, because they're not taking the time to like do unique passwords and stuff like that, it's a disaster waiting to happen.
Definitely is, 100%. Yeah. A bit of a horror story, but a lot of learning and takeaways for people from that talk. So yeah, brilliant stuff. I know you said you were nervous at the beginning, but to be perfectly honest, we couldn't tell. So
absolute pro. Absolute pro.
Yeah, brilliant. So cheers, Dorian.
Right.
Thanks very much for your time. Have a great weekend. Cheers, mate.